got together. It took us a little while to figure out what we were going to ask, but I think we should start with the history of feminism. So I'd like to throw this one to Debbie. Could you talk to us about what feminism looked like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and just give us your background and experience, especially, and we're trying to focus on the Midwest.
Sure. So I was born in 1969, so I wasn't really cognizant of a lot of what was going on, other than Sesame Street and my mother working. But I wrote a book that actually started as my PhD dissertation, and it was about the fights and frenzies around feminism in America over the past 40 years. And I was really interested in unearthing, doing archival research to look at what had been said about feminism in the early days, in the early second wave days, I should say. And just to back up, I think when we're talking about feminism in the Midwest, we can go back even further to, the so-called first wave. Jane Addams, whose biographer we have in the house here, Lucy Knight, very lucky to have her here. Jane Addams and other remarkable women who came out of the Hull House movement considered themselves feminists. And their issues were, ones that we recognize as, today's feminist issues as well. But they also were very interested in issues of peace and children's protection. Working women's rights was a big deal, as it is now, and suffrage, of course. But in the late 60s and early 70s, the resurgence of feminism that we saw really, grew out of the New Left and the Civil Rights Movement. And there are sort of two myths about it that I think is a good way to frame this question. One is that it all happened out east. It didn't. There were radical groups, with colorful names that popped up in Kansas City, Missouri. There was one called Radical Feminist 28. And here in Chicago, there was the Chicago Women's Liberation Movement. I'm just kind of curious, showing hands, how many people have heard of Chicago Women's Liberation Union? Okay, good. The historians are not this way. But it's not like a commonly, heard name. And at the time, it came about in 1969 and kind of lasted until 1977. There was also a group called the West Side Group. And these feminist cells, there was a lot of cross-pollination and cross-fertilization, and they existed in a state of flux with members kind of, often leaving one group and starting or joining another. And this, they were kind of loosely affiliated, and they circulated writings and manifestos and, thought pieces and papers and slogans. And then they kind of came together at national gatherings. But there were a couple that I think are interesting, just to call their names into the room. I was kind of wondering, these people walk through the doors of this, event. Heather Booth was actually a Brooklyn native, so she, kind of came from the East, but came here. She dropped out of her cheerleading team because it discriminated against black people, and after she heard Martin Luther King Jr. speak. So she's one who was, heavily influenced by the Civil Rights Movement and brought her spirit of social justice into feminism here in Chicago. Pamela Allen was also a former SNCC organizer who later became active in Chicago Women's Liberation Union, and she organized with the help of Shulamith Firestone, which is the name that's probably more recognizable. And Pamela Allen was the one who actually kind of codified, she wrote a paper called about the small group process. She kind of codified the process that's known as consciousness phasing. How many people have heard the term consciousness phasing, right? That's kind of like part of our lexicon. It's just part of what we do. It's what we're doing here. So, but that was big time, from Chicagoan, you could say. And the second myth, I think, is that that what happened in the 60s and 70s doesn't have much to do with what's happening in feminism today. A lot of times people think the organizing, of the past, that was the past, and this is now. And I beg to differ, and that's actually my whole book is sort of about why that's not the case and how we can learn from the debates that came before us. But I was really interested too that Heather Booth, the Chicagoan, was one who was very vocal about the question of defining feminism. It's at that originating moment. I think it's a debate we're still having. She and Naomi Weisstein wrote a paper that was all about should change be internal or external? Is it inner? Is it our heads that we have to change, or is it the social conditions of women that need changing out there in the world? And has anyone read Lean In or heard of Sheryl Sandberg? I mean, I think we're still having this debate, you know, is it a mindset, is it an attitude, or is it, you know, a revolution that needs to take place in our workplaces, right? So I think that, that, you know, a lot of this was going on way back. And I also think it's interesting that we're having this panel now because there's, in women's history, in the academy, there's a big movement to look at the regionalized, you know, kind of localized organizing that was going on. There's a book by Nancy Whittier called Feminist Generations, The Persistence of the Radical Women's Movement, that looks at what was going on in Columbus, Ohio in the 60s and 70s. There's also a book that came out recently by Joe Rieger called Everywhere and Nowhere, Contemporary Feminism in the United States. And it kind of looks at, you know, the state of contemporary feminism, but also looks very specifically at community level organizing. And so I think we're looking right now at feminism in all its like regional multiplicities, both past and present. So I think it's a really interesting, you know, moment to be in this room, in this location, having this conversation and bringing it all alive and into the present.
Welcome.
Come on in. There's lots of chairs around.
So I don't know if that answers the whole question about what's going on. What did the beginnings of organized feminism in the Midwest look like, and how does it differ there? I mean, I guess I kind of want to put out there that there was cross-pollination. It wasn't like you know, nothing was happening out here. Chicagoans were central to it, even if we're not, you know, as consistently thought of as on the map.
I think this leads us into our next question, which is, now we've got a little bit of background, hopefully. Why do you think feminism in the Midwest is different from feminism in other geographical locations? And then where do you think feminism has its hubs? And Veronica, could you start us off with that?
Sure. I really think that it's different because the Midwest is different. I think that feminism reflects what is going on, its environment, it's a standpoint. You know, going back to a great historical example is that one of the projects of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union was JANE, the collective, which is, you know, women who had been trained to perform abortions, illegal abortions. That was a major activity here in Chicago and in the Midwest. That's something that did not have to happen in New York because they had legal abortion. They were more focused on getting women to New York and housed. So, I mean, so it's hard to, I think it's hard to make those kind of parallels and comparisons when the situations were different. It's a lot like the conversations we've been having about marriage equality over the years. How can people be in Mississippi or Alabama or Nebraska trying to advocate for marriage equality when they don't even feel safe being out? So it's all contextual. And so Midwest feminism is going to look a lot different than New York feminism because New York is just a different place. They're in a different moment. They may be shinier, sparklier, because New York is a little shinier and sparklier. But I like to say, you know, Chicago, we're a little more rough and tough.
Add one thing, actually, because I think you remind me that the divide was also, you know, obviously a theme. In particular, Betty Friedan in the 60s and 70s, you know, when she wrote The Feminine Mystique, and then saw the younger radical feminists kind of come to voice with their more radical sexual politic kind of ideas. She was from Peoria. People know that about her? I don't know. Yeah, she's from Peoria. And she was very concerned with how what she called the, you know, coastal feminism and the sexual politics, you know, that looked at the way that interactions in our most intimate relations were politicized, you know, that sex was political. She was very worried that these orgasm politics wouldn't play in Peoria. And she wrote that. I spent some time in her archives. And it was interesting to see how, even though she was living out east, she still very much held on to her Peorian roots as like the, you know, bellwether for how is it going to play among her audience, which was, you know, largely middle-class white American housewives. So there were a lot of factions going on then as there are now.
Claudia, can I also add to that? Yeah. So I think we've all heard about, you know, how Chicago is the space where there's a lot of violence, right? And so I'm thinking right now, at present, there's been a lot of organizing that's happening, that's being sort of strategically planned by a number of young women and girls who might not necessarily use feminism, the term, to identify in that way, but a lot of the work that they're actually doing is feminist insofar as its practice, right, and its ideals and its beliefs. And so if we think about Fearless leading the youth, this is a youth group from 63rd and near Washington Park, right, on the near south side of Chicago. They've been at the forefront of the mental health movement, trying to get the University of Chicago to reopen up a trauma center, right? And so normally we wouldn't sort of see this as a feminist movement because it doesn't necessarily get marketed that way for much wider mainstream audiences, you know, nationally speaking. And so I think that though, is very much at its core a feminist issue, and it's also very much a feminist part of a, you know, much broader and also localized feminist movement. There are the incarceration rates also. I think if we start to sort of think about the prison industrial complex, right, there are a number of organizations and people doing work around that issue, which is very much steeped in the history of feminism in the Midwest as well, right? Like women who were abolitionists, who were against slavery and were for emancipation, were, you know, maybe perhaps didn't have the language of feminism either in those times, but it was very much a feminist practice that continues to this day, where a lot of people at present, you know, such as Miriam Kaba from Project Mia, are engaged in sort of trying to overturn the incarceration rates and trying to figure out alternatives to imprisoning certain youth in Chicago and maybe doing other practices such as transformative justice. And so I think that that's a different angle to feminism that we often don't consider, but that is very much feminist. So.
And I think too, you know, we talk about feminism in the Midwest in general, and Chicago in particular. You know, Chicago is in the Midwest, but it is not the definition of Midwestern. You know, there are all sorts of other different places. You know, a lot of people tell me that they, you know, when they move here, that it's like the one and only place that they've ever been that you can call yourself Chicagoan, but not actually be in Chicago, like not actually live in Chicago, which I'm guilty of as well, because I live in the suburbs. But you know, the feminism in the suburbs or in small town Illinois is it looks very, very different than it does even in Chicago, where, you know, I found myself particularly dealing with issues, well, and I guess maybe this might lead into our second question, but of just varying definitions of feminism that, you know, I've encountered, when I used to work in a really small town, encountered women who consider themselves feminists, but then would tell me that I'm just too outspoken when I would voice my opinions. And I think that seems to be unique to not Chicago, but small town Midwest as well.
Well, let's jump into what is your definition of feminism? It's not a loaded question.
I think actually
The follow-up is okay. So does defining it help you live it? That's my follow-up to that.
I was going to say, just listening to the conversation that we've had in the past 5 minutes, you can hear there's so many different threads and strands, and, you know, we can have a panel on any one of these pieces of feminism, right? And I think at the end of my book, I wrote, feminism in the new millennium is not so much dead or an anachronism as it is a former seedling that took root and is now so grown, its DNA so mutated by forces it is encountered along the way that it's branched out into the culture at large. And like an organism in evolution, a single word, identity, slogan, or catchphrase could never hope to capture the whole sum totality again. To attempt to sum it all up would be like trying to push a tree back into a seed. So I think, you know, I'm sure we all kind of agree up here that we're talking about feminisms, right? There's no one. And I would just say my definition is basic, you know, I just kind of go back to basics, and I would just say feminism for me is the belief in the social, political, and economic equality of all women. Simplest definition, but, you know, with the caveat that it's so much more as well.
No, I totally agree. I go to more of a dictionary definition of feminism, this really basic ground level, because it does grow from there, and people define it and find their own place to throw their hat on it in different parts. So I try to make it keep it as general as possible to start a conversation.
Feminism doesn't always mean jean jackets.
I know.
I have a feeling but maybe Midwestern feminism. Denim
This was,
feminism.
well, yeah, I mean, I walked in and saw Debbie. I put mine on too.
They clearly all planned this and left me out.
New York is going to be aghast.
That's funny.
Claudia.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I would also say that that sort of understanding of feminism also allows us to understand that feminism has a very long history globally, despite the fact that the term itself might have been coined recently, right, in terms of not so long ago. So I'm thinking of perhaps Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, right, who was a Mexican nun who wrote about how women were being treated during, was it the 17th century? Does that make sense? During the 17th century, during the Spanish Inquisition that took place in Mexico, right? And so I think that, you know, that feminism is sort of, or feminisms are found worldwide, and that its history, it's much longer than what we understand it to be in the U.S.
You know, I tend to see feminism as I want my fearless females, my students, to see feminism. And it really, that means to me that I want them to understand that they have choices and that those choices are endless. That, you know, if they want to be, you know, a teacher or a, you know, a nurse, something stereotypically what we've seen historically feminine profession, then that's fine. You know, but if they want to be an astronaut or a computer programmer or, you know, whatever else that they want, then that's, you know, more power to them as well. And so I think that it's important because I do see a lot of my students kind of struggle with that, you know, they want to be a teacher, but they don't want to just be a teacher, you know, and that's, or they want to be a nurse, but that's not enough, you know, and so they struggle with that internalized, you know, that feminism has given them options, so they should do something more. And I think that that is important for them to explore, but I also think that that's important for them to know that, you know, you're not just a teacher or just a nurse or, you know, just a student or whatever, you know, whatever you are. So, so yeah, I see it more broadly, I guess, in terms of choices, professions.
Yeah, I struggle with that at work. I run a program for women who are majoring in science and engineering. So a lot of the attention that my work gets is trying to get women to be PhD faculty in engineering, biology. And so when I do have nursing students, especially, come around to my programming, I can sense that they feel like they don't quite belong, or maybe they're not quite worthy because they're just nursing students. And I'm like, you're taking the same chemistry, the same math, the same biology, and probably even more other human biology courses than my engineers are taking. And so you have skills that, you know, computer scientists don't have, and they have skills you don't have, but that's okay. And as long as you are as empowered as you want to be, go be a nurse. Strive to be, you know, the best nurse you can be. Maybe be head nurse. All of those sorts of things. But I try to talk to them, and I don't want to say validate their choices, but you can tell. I can tell that they feel like they're just a nurse. Like there's not just a nurse. It's a very important job.
Since we're on the topic, I'm throwing you a wild card.
Oh.
That's okay. Can we talk a little bit about the workplace and how you see the workplace? Since we have ventured down this road a little bit, but I know it's not in our list of questions. I think it's important because we all are going to be in the workplace or are in the workplace, and it's just a part of our lives, or all of our lives. What are your thoughts on feminism in the workplace? And I'm thinking in the context of being out as a feminist in the workplace.
Well, that's the whole basis of me calling myself a professional feminist. It's not that they're, I get students all the time who are like, well, how do I be a professional feminist? I'm like, you just be a feminist in your job. Because, we need feminist chemists, we need feminist nurses, we need feminist car, repair people, all those sorts of things. As long as you're bringing the feminist ethic to your job, I would say that is what professional
Can I
feminist
ask a question?
Carrie?
Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Huh?
So how are you a feminist at work?
Oh, well, my job is working with women who are in science, engineering, and Title IX, and so I think like the definition of my work is rooted in feminism. But I also when I talk about being a professional feminist in other jobs, is to bring that feminist ethic to someone's work. So I do try to empower my students without beating them down with the feminist bat. Like, you have to be a feminist, blah, 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 and keep your name, and blah, 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 and all those sorts of things. It's just about, valuing their work, essentially, and valuing their voice.
Yeah. Taking that. I guess I too would identify as a professional feminist. My first job out of college was as a research assistant at the National Council for Research on Women, which is where I met Veronica way back when, which is an umbrella organization for women's research and policy centers around the country. I think there are now like 130 of them. And I was, I think we're a rare but increasingly multiple breed. I was mentored by feminists. All the people in my nonprofit that were in the higher up positions had PhDs, so I figured, I guess I'm supposed to go get my PhD because that's what women around here do, and that's a track I want to get going on. And so I did that, and then came back to that organization, and then I've worked with other feminist organizations right now, the Op-Ed Project, which has a presence here in Chicago, and I would say it's a hub of Midwestern feminism. I feel like we've all moves through there. But that's it's a social venture designed to diversify the range of voices we hear from in public debate, starting with more women's. And I'm also, in my business, I'm a thought leadership coach who works with women to help them get their expertise out there in public forums. So I feel very out as a feminist. It's what I write, live, breathe. But in my newest chapter, I also am really kind of riveted and obsessed with being out as a feminist mama. I have boy-girl twins, and I'm currently obsessed with the gendering of childhood in the earliest years of life. That's going to be my next book, actually a graphic memoir, probably. And I just think it's important to be talking about the issues that hit our lives, whatever stage we're at, and whatever kind of feminist incarnations those life stages take. So for me right now, it's about, figuring out how to kind of make comments when people buy my daughter pink princesses and I don't want them, but I don't want to hurt their feelings, So that's not the workplace, but it's being, out as a feminist.
It's such a complicated question for me. I think what I could probably do is share a story about when I first realized feminism, this term is so political. I was working at a law firm. I worked at a law firm for 6 years while I was an undergrad, so that I could put myself through undergrad studies. And I remember one time just sharing with some of the paralegals that I identified as a feminism because I was very excited about what I was learning, and having been raised by 6 phenomenal Latino women who never used the word, I was like, oh my God, I've discovered this term that really encapsulates the living experiences that I had growing up. And it was awful. The repercussions of of just sort of uttering the word was that it was bad. I had people not want to give me work, try to, cut my hours down. I mean, it's for, just because of the way that I identify, right? So I think that very much has to do with the fact that we're steeped in a society that is still very patriarchal, right? And in many ways very misogynist, right? And that patriarchy can be really much practiced not just by the male gender, but also by the female gender. Because the outlash that I ended up getting in this space did not actually come from the men, but came from the women. So it was really interesting to me that I thought I would find that same support that I found at home with my family, and that I ended up sort of being ousted, right, for simply identifying as a feminist. And so I think that in certain professional spaces, depending on how you identify, but also the fact that you sort of bring these ethics with you, which can mean like empowering other women, right, understanding that your voice matters, that you get to speak up, right? So if you're in a meeting, that means that you actually get to express your opinion, and that you just don't sort of wait for someone to point at you and ask you to share your thoughts, right? I mean, there are many sort of angles to what that looks like in professional spaces, but I would say that that was my experience. And it actually only helped me want to be a much more radical feminist. Thank you.
Yeah, well, to piggyback off of that, when I did teach in a small town, it was also the women that sort of ostracized me, and I don't even know that I would have identified as a feminist yet at that point. But it was very soon after that I sort of realized that that I had a word for this. But the women that I taught with in this small town, they like I said, they considered themselves feminists. Many of them kept their names. They did all the feminist check marks, I guess you could call them. But then, I said, I don't even remember what I had said, but it was something really assertive. And one of the women turned to me and said, well, that's why you're not married yet. And keep in mind, I was 22. So I was like, or because I'm 22. And not that there's anything wrong with being married at 22 if that's what you want, but I felt really young at the time. And so that was sort of what clicked for me, and I was like, oh, it's not okay for women to treat each other like this. And so now, I guess being a professional feminist or being an out feminist in my job is just, again, working with students, and giving them the word well before I had it, so that they can describe themselves as feminists if they choose to do so.
So the next question has to do with kind of the future of feminism. And I'm going to start with Veronica, but I'll ask the question first. And I don't know if all of you've heard about this, but there's this report that was put out called Fem Future by Vanessa Valenti and Courtney Baxter. Martin, sorry. So they're Courtney, but also feminist. And they put out this report. There's a lot of backlash, and they're kind of dealing with repercussions now. So I'm hoping that, and this kind of inspired this panel tonight too for me on a personal level, because I felt like we were overlooked, and it's on the East Coast again, and it's talking about East Coast feminism. I think it kind of has that space. So what are your thoughts on Fem Future, and what does it mean for Midwest feminism?
So the Fem Future report really bowled me over, and I wasn't even aware that it was brewing. I always feel like I have to apologize for that for some reason, because I sent out a few tweets last summer about that they were working on this. But for me, on many levels, it really hit a foul note, because it was created it's published through the Barnard Research Center on Research and Women. And so for me as an academic, that means it needs to be super high quality as an academic, as a university publication. Despite the fact that, Vanessa and Courtney may not consider themselves academics. Courtney considers herself a journalist. So the first fundamental flaw was they set up this history, which is a very short history, like a page at the most, of history of online feminism that completely ignored the history of online feminism and framed it as an accident. And as someone who was there at the Stone Age of online feminism back in the late 90s, it was not an accident that we found each other and created feminist spaces. We created feminist spaces in the same way that feminist organizations have been created forever because they were needed. There weren't any. We couldn't find any. So we created blogs, we created websites before there were blogs and treated them kind of like blogs, those sorts of things. They also, the people they created or pulled around the round table were very East Coast centric and ignored the Midwest. Anything actually off the East Coast, really, because I didn't even think the West Coast was even very well represented. There's discussion about the future of feminism online. I also had more organizational critiques. They kept talking about success, and they never defined success. Is success getting the Equal Pay Act actually passed in a reality? Is it getting the ERA passed, or is it us being able to be feminist and still, have a big house? And that was some of the questions I had. What does success mean to them? They talked a lot about how feminism online is being run on this third shift, and I really feel like feminism has been run on the third shift for many generations. And it's a reality. It's a sad reality. It is a sad reality. I wish we didn't have to, but they just had a lot of things that were very general, and I wanted more definitions. That was a lot of my critique. They also did not come from an intersectional analysis, as far as I was concerned. They did put out a response a few weeks ago that I thought was not very well addressing of their critiques. There were some very harsh critiques out there, some that were pretty personal, in my opinion, and they didn't really address those. And I feel like that this kind of conversation, even though they may be personal and they wanted to say, well, people were just attacking us as people, let's not talk about that, I think we do need to talk about those. Because if they are going to dismiss those critiques as trashing, we need to open those up and talk about what does it mean to trash versus critique. There's been a lot of citation of the Joe Freeman essay from the 70s about trashing it, and if you read it, it really draws some criteria of what trashing means versus critique. There is still a fine line, but I'm not exactly sure that most of the critiques of Fem Future fall under trashing versus honest critique. So on the basis of Fem Future, the report, I think it's a good start. I think it's great that it started this conversation. I think it's unfortunately started a conversation where there's more critique than us planning. But I have found more people online that are for, I think that I'm more politically aligned with in terms of organizational futures and organizational planning, that I'm happy for that.
I'm curious, like, how many people have heard of it? I just want to know, like, in the room, are we talking about the same, kind of common knowledge? So for those of you who haven't, it came out of a hunger on the part of two feminist bloggers who were part of the original crew at the blog Feministing, which became a very popular forum. When was it started, Feministing? Was it in
2004.
Yeah. And now they have, they grew to like 500,000 monthly, hits. So they're very, they became very prominent and influential, which is great for feminism to have a space, that's prominent and influential. But they burned out, and a lot of bloggers who have been at it for no pay, little sleep, link loves, the only reward, there's just this sense of burnout. So what Courtney and Vanessa did was come up with a project that they hoped would help create sustainability for online feminism, so that the next generation, the fourth, fifth, sixth waves of feminism could kind of come into infrastructure rather than create it all themselves and burn out and, what's the wheel, recycle, right. And so what they were interested in doing was bringing together different stakeholders, bloggers, online influencers, with funders, with nonprofits, sort of, the on-land or feminist organizations that often were turning to online younger feminists as communications consultants because they had mad skills that, the women, largely second wavers who had founded these organizations didn't really have. So they were wanting to kind of cross-pollinate more and just kind of create a femme future, right? And I think, I just as a full disclosure, I was invited to that initial little thing, but I couldn't go because I was busy, like, you know, moving or something to Chicago, getting out of New York. And I used to work at the Barnard Center for Research on Women and know the funder, and, you know, like I'm sort of immersed in this thing. But I think what is interesting to me about the report and its aftermath is how much we are actually repeating history from the 60s and 70s. I mean, I find that striking, both with the Joe Freeman conversation around trashing, and I'm glad that that's informing the current debate, but also, you know, around the forgetting. Gerda Lerner is this great women's historian who died this year, right? This year. Said that the only constant in feminist history is a constant forgetting of our past. So I think, you know, Veronica had a really important point that we have to know our past and, you know, and honor it. But I think also what's really important is that we don't get lost in the critique of the critique of the critique, you know what I mean, is that we keep it moving forward, because that's what happened in around 1975, radical feminist movement kind of imploded on itself. Because there was so much, I mean, for many reasons, but one reason was there was so much infighting. And so I find it interesting and painful that, you know, in a conversation about feminist futures, we end up having a conversation that kind of killed feminism in the past, you know, so I sort of want to, my hope, and I think, you know, Vanessa and Courtney's hope, and I think the critics' hope is all that we can go into a feminist future finding, you know, better ways to disagree and to keep it moving.
So here's my last question, and we'll open up the floor because I'm sure you all have questions by now with all these awesome points and thoughts, insights. For each of you, what does a femme future look like? And if you can talk about it in the context of being here in Midwest, since we're talking about feminism in the Midwest. Claudia, you want to start us?
Yeah, I have so many things to say about that. Yeah, it's a great question. I think where I'm at the moment is that, you know, I'm a former organizer, and I still do organizing nowadays, but not very steeped in as many communities as I was before. But I think for me, what the future of feminism looks like is very much a future that engages, or feminisms that engage transsexual issues, right? Which I think that there's a lot of debate around that right now. So whether, you know, if someone identifies as is trans female identified, I think that those are very much issues that feminism needs to take on and address. The other issue that I think also needs to be addressed is the prison industrial complex. I think that it's just very much a necessity that we can't really talk about feminism without actually looking at, you know, how many youth are actually being incarcerated, and not just any youth, but black and brown. I think that is also an issue that is very, very much important. I just lost my point as to why I think that that's a feminist issue, but probably because historically it was, and then, you know, as time has evolved.
Well, the incarceration problem is pushing our black and brown communities to be female-led.
Right.
I mean, and so it's just, when we talk about policy in terms of, you know, all these black and brown women need to just find husbands to get off of welfare and, you know, be sustainable. Well, you know, our men are being incarcerated.
Right.
Maybe our husbands are incarcerated.
Yeah.
Maybe the men who want to marry and have a nuclear family and have a stable home are being incarcerated in a way that we can't create the families we want.
Right.
So,
and not just for to add to that, because I think that that's an excellent point. I think that there's also a rise in women being incarcerated. So previously, white women or white young girls were the highest statistic of incarcerated youth, and now it's become predominantly black and brown women as well. So, but gender aside, I think that either way, it's, you know, it's very much a feminist issue because it really is sort of steeped in so far as like much larger societal issues. So I'll come back to that point, or maybe when we all sort of break into circles, I'll sort of get all the details on that again. But I do a lot of work around that, which is why I feel that it's very important to me. And it's also part of the reason why I decided to go back to graduate school, because these are some of the issues that women or feminist writers of color from the 60s, 70s, and 80s were talking about. And I feel that when people like Audre Lorde or Bell Hooks or Gloria Anzaldúa, Sherry Moraga get taught in women's and gender studies courses or any kind of university courses, their voices really get flattened, right? At times it's sort of like to fill in the gap, like, okay, now we have to talk about the women of color. And we don't really actually go into the details of what they were talking about, right? That they were talking about economics, that they were talking about the war. They were very much involved in these movements. They weren't just involved in what was a feminist movement, but these other sort of overlapping movements like the civil rights movement, right? And so I think that these are all issues that affect women, but people at large, and so I'll stop there.
Yes, actually. Yes, I do. I mean, like Claudia, I want to see a more intersectional feminist future. I think when we talk about women's rights, we also talk about everyone's rights. When we talk about gender norms and sexuality, we talk about our gender norms as women, but also if you are a gay man or if you are transgender or on the spectrum somewhere. And I think that when we free up those choices for women, we free up choices for men as well. And I think that that's really important, because to have feminist men, I think that is really, really important too. So that's, I guess that's in a nutshell what I'd like to see.
I think one of the lessons that Courtney and Vanessa, who I have worked with before, so I do try to work, despite my critique of their work, learned through the critique is that despite the fact that the internet is global and international, we still live locally. And so feminism still needs to be, I think, global, act local, personal is political kind of movement. And so the fact that I can understand that the fact that they ran Feministing for so long, that they were getting emails from people in small town USA saying, I feel like I'm the only feminist, I'm the only gay, I'm the only lesbian person in my small town, and reading your blog has been so much to me. I think that what hopefully they've realized is that by doing that, they have a responsibility to say, but that there's this blog run by this woman or this man or this collective just, a few miles away from you, that, there are other people. We're not all in New York. You don't have to move to New York to be a feminist or to do feminist work, but there are people in Omaha, in Lawrence, Kansas, who are feminists and are doing amazing work.
This is like a whole dissertation, right? Just down the path. Highlights. I mean, I think the feminist future that I envision is one where we, first of all, nurture our young. And by that I mean, build the bridges to the next generation and kind of create infrastructure. I'm 44, I feel like a grandma on this panel, but, well, maybe not.
Yeah, 38.
But, where I was once the young feminist on the panel, and I think we're still having these conversations about how do we build bridges, how do we pass the torch without extinguishing the flame, and, this is an old conversation, and I want it to stop being old. I want it to just be like, let's just keep on keeping on and find ways to, to bring young women into our professional feminist lives in ways that are natural and organic, and learn from them and be mentored from them, with all their man skills that they bring, right? Second, I would say I envision a femme future where we no longer look for a leader, or for, sort of who, or sort of fight for visibility or recognition within our own movement. I think it's painful when that happens, and my friend Lucy just sent me a really recent, a great email recently about Gloria Steinem would always be asked, you know, or everybody's always, you know, people are kind of asking, who's the next Gloria Steinem? Who's the next Gloria Steinem? People are always wanting to put a face on the movement, right? Media loves a, you know, a person that you can pin it to. And her comeback was, you know, well, there shouldn't have had to be a Gloria Steinem in the first place, right? Like let's get past this, you know, such a raw need for women's movement, and such a raw need to pin it on a, you know, a certain mediagenic or, you know, person with access kind of face, right? Did I get that quote right?
Yes.
More or less. Third, I would say I envision a femme future where we have honest to goodness parity. I mean, come on, it's 2013 and we are still having the debates and the conversations about, you know, about the issues that we did in the 70s. We're nowhere near parity. We're 18% of Congress, right, and 15% of the pundits on Sunday talk shows are male. We're like 3% of corporate boards. Yeah, we see Sheryl Sandberg rising and Maria. But they're, you know, they're a token. They're not the norm. And it's just, you know, we're still so in the dark ages. So I feel like we have so much left to do. And when I think of femme future, of course I think about my 3.5-year-old daughter and my 3.5-year-old son. And I think about, you know, the future that I want them to live in. And I want feminism to evolve as it's continuing to evolve, to be about gender and not, you know, just about sex and not just about women. I am equally concerned with, you know, the norms, painful norms of masculinity that my son is already encountering, and the, you know, plastic tippy-shoed Barbie feet that, you know, are in my house, you know, that my daughter has glommed onto. That came out funny, tippy, you know what I mean? How Barbie has the tippy, she calls these tippy shoes, and Barbie has tippy shoe feet. So, you know, I just think, like, who would we all become if we weren't stereotyped by gender from first whale, you know, and what would that femme future look like going forth from there? That's the world I'd like to see.
I want to hear